Hi guys, I'm Julian Swanton. I wanted to take you through a journey today, a journey of the financial system. Try and step back, take a macro look at things and try and understand how it all hangs together, how these threads come together to make sense of where we're at currently and where we're headed, what it means for us going forward. It's a significant time we're in. It's a time of a lot of change, a lot of radical sort of policies. So I think it's a key time to really take a look at this. So let's get stuck in. The first chart I've got for you here is the US 10-year rate. In my view, this is the most important data point there is in finance. If you understand what's going on with this yield curve, it helps you explain all asset classes, the price of all asset classes. Everything benchmarks off this. Everything is a spread to this. It tells you the value of the money and how to discount all future cash flows in any asset. So it's really key. So taking a look here, first thing to note is the stability you had for a long period of time. You had this 200-year period where rates very seldom went outside a 7 to 3% range here. And then more recently, you suddenly see, hey, hang on, something's gone on more recent times, and sure enough, it has. In 1971, we left the gold standard. Previously, financial system money was backed by gold, and that really was the reason why we had this stability. And sure enough, we lost that stability when that was broken. Rates spiked up to 16%, thereabouts here, and we've been on a 4-decade decline ever since. In terms of rates, and that's significant. A lot of people have only known a falling interest rate environment. So anyway, let's understand what's caused this. Why has this happened? To understand that environment, that cycle, you really have to understand debt, because ultimately interest rates are driven by debt, because money supply is driven by debt. As debt's issued, that injects fresh money into the economy. And then as the economy reacts to that, so does interest rates. So looking at these charts here, I think the first, on the right hand side, you've got GDP adjusted debt. You can see two big run-ups. First one during the world wars, followed by the Great Depression, when that debt came back to reality. The gold standard kept it honest. And then this increasing trajectory been on ever since. And if you step over to the left here, you see that debt, different measure this time. This is absolute debt, so nominal terms, not adjusted for inflation or GDP or anything. And you can see this parabolic increase, particularly starting about here when the gold standard was broken. And really, what's been happening is pretty much every 8 to 10 years, the money supply has been doubling. That's how parabolic this is. Now that's interesting to know in itself. If money is becoming more common, to the tune of twice as common every 10 years, there's twice as much money every 10 years entering the economy, then you would expect asset prices for things that aren't increasing in supply, like land, gold, fine art, rare cars, you'd expect their price to pretty much double every 10 years, because they're not increasing in supply, and money's growing twice as common every 10 years. And then that's pretty much what you've seen. House prices and gold, particularly more recently, you've seen that exact pattern. And I think that's fascinating, because a lot of managers, a lot of investors, pat themselves on the back and demand fees from their clients for this great performance, and really, if they're honest, what they're really achieving is just this money supply effect. Everything's gone up. It's not really skill, as people would like you to believe. Well, there's obviously a little element of that. So let's take another step back and ask, how did we get here? Why have we got this enormous parabolic increase in debt going on? So to understand that, I think we have to go even right back. I would suggest Roman times and sort of empires of old, because essentially this is the same old problem we've always had. Ultimately, your ruling class has ambitions that is greater than their budgets, that exceeds their budgets. That's really the ultimate problem here. So for them, they've got their most effective way of gaining wealth, controlling the nation's wealth to meet their ambitions, is to control the money supply. Historically, they when it was anchored in gold, it was quite difficult. They tried alchemy to try and create gold. That obviously didn't work. The Romans diluted their coins, but people cottoned onto that, and that ultimately failed too. But I guess the ultimate ambition of central planners, if you like, of the ruling class, was this breaking of the gold standard in 1971. That allowed them to really control the money supply and increase debt in an unrestrained way to achieve their goals and their ambitions. Now, there are those who argue that this increase in debt and this breaking of the gold standard has been a good thing for the economy, and that it's allowed the GDP growth we've enjoyed and the wealth we've enjoyed since that period. So let's go on and explore those claims and try and understand what this debt's really done to the economy. The first thing to come to grips with is this relationship between debt and interest rates. It's an interesting relationship. In the first instance, when an economy gets a large injection of debt that it's not used to, the first response is inflation. All that money enters the money supply, it gets spent, and it pushes prices up. And that forces central banks to respond to protect the purchasing power of wage earners, and so interest rates increase. Pretty soon though, that those interest payments and that debt, the burden of paying back that debt and paying the interest on it starts to bite and starts to become a drag on the economy. And so the only way to keep the growth going in that environment, of course, to offset that, the central bank's forced now to cut rates to try and mitigate the drag and the cost of those interest payments. And you see that in this chart on the right here. You see that interest rates being slashed during the Great Depression, and you see them, like I say, for the last 4 decades continuously being cut in the period we're in now. And the debt carries on growing, interestingly, because the absent a Great Depression or some big correction, the economy becomes dependent on that debt, and that's why the central banks have to keep cutting rates, because without that continuous increase in debt, the economy grinds to a halt. It's become used to it, become dependent on it, really. But of course, eventually too much debt does become unsustainable, and conventionally there's only really two responses to that. The first is to allow the debt to reset, allow debt restructuring, allow debt defaults, and that was what the Great Depression was all about. The gold standard kind of forced that response. There was no backdoor way of printing money or resolving it any other way. The other option conventionally is just to kick the can down the road and come up with ever more creative ways of getting more debt into the economy, to keep the game going, keep the gravy train going. And that's really where we've been. You can see this chart here. And here, this 2008-2009 period was really, really key. Option 2 had reached its limits. The interest rates couldn't go any lower. Lenders didn't want to lend anymore. They were getting more and more risk averse. Borrowers already had too much debt. They didn't want to borrow. There wasn't enough good investment opportunities for them to keep investing in. And debt slowed down. It didn't actually even decrease. We didn't even get many write-downs or defaults. It just plateaued. And yet that caused a major financial crisis. The world almost came completely unraveled and came to an end just during this period here. So central banks needed another option. The economy had grown dependent on this continuously parabolic doubling of money every 10 years. It would become reliant on that. And central banks needed another way to keep that money injection going. So welcome quantitative easing. That was their solution. So if lenders weren't going to lend money and borrowers weren't going to borrow, they were going to push money into the economy themselves. And they did it by printing money and by buying any assets they could get hold of, specifically government bonds, but also mortgage-backed securities, even stocks in some economies. So that was what saved the day, really. I mean, arguably it just kicked the can down the road and delayed the inevitable, but it did mean that although this chart shows debt levelling off, they were effectively able to keep injecting money into the economy through this QE, so effectively carrying this trajectory going. So in order to understand what this, how option 3 ends and where we're going to go into this next phase, we really need to understand what's going on with wealth. So let's move on. I've called this disappearing wealth, but really, if you think about it, there's been a hope for a long time, and there still is, that technology in the future will and really now already should have freed up time for us, should have gotten rid of mundane tasks, and really given us a lot more leisure time and made life a lot easier. We should be working less. Likewise, globalization, promised to give us lower cost goods, utilize unemployed people in developing nations, and that should have freed up time for us too, if it's cheaper to buy basics that we need. So if all this was going on, these two effects, and they were genuine effects, why is this chart showing what it's showing? This is showing that since essentially when the gold standard was broken in the early 70s, you've had working families, two-parent families, working 30% more hours. And for what? I mean, really, the living standards haven't improved. In the 70s, we still had cars, we still had electricity and gadgets, albeit simpler ones. But really, the quality of life, holidays, it was all very similar to what it is now in many regards. So what's going on? Why are we working 30% more hours? Well, the answer is those effects from technology and from globalization, they have generated a huge amount of wealth, but clearly it's not going to the working families. That's what this is showing you here. The working class, common people have not been benefiting from this. They've had to work harder and harder just to maintain, or arguably not even maintain, a depreciating standard of living. So who have been the beneficiaries of this wealth in that case? These are the people I refer to as the ruling class, but they get other names. Some people refer to them as the deep state, or the shadow government. They get those terms in the US in particularly. But I like to refer to them as ruling class because they're the same people that have always corrupted every empire. They're the same people that have whose ambitions and greed have caused this problem and this wealth inequality since the dawn of time. Quite simply, they're the very, very wealthy. They're the billionaires in today's society. And on this chart here, they're this bottom line. They're the top 0.01% holders of the nation's wealth. These guys, they have huge, powerful networks. When you have billions of dollars, you have a lot of loyalty. You're hiring a lot of people. You're able to lobby and get people in Parliament. You have a lot of unelected officials who are loyal to you. You have a lot of CEOs of companies who you've appointed or being influential on the boards on because you're major shareholders, particularly the social media companies today is the case. Media especially, it's amazing. Just about every media outlet is owned entirely by billionaires. There's very few independent media or media that aren't doing the will of, or at least following the agendas and the beliefs of these billionaires. So it's significant as well that if you have such networks and such influence, you get the inside track on any news that's going on. In the investment world, if you're the first to get hold of some news, or you're the first to really see where things are going, you're going to make better investment decisions and grow your wealth faster than anyone else. And that's what you see down here. Since the gold standard was broken in the 70s here, so these guys have done a superb job of growing their wealth. They've used their networks and their influence, and they've grown it steadily. And as they grow it, they get more influence and even greater networks. And so you're starting to see a parabolic increase in their wealth. So these top 0.01%, these guys, they've grown their wealth from about 2.5% of the nation's wealth back in here in the 70s. Now they've grown that about 500%. They're currently at about 12.5%, even more. This chart's old now. It's carried on parabolically growing. These guys have grown their wealth incredibly. And as you walk down the wealth pyramid, the top 0.1% and the top 1%, they've grown their wealth too, but they're less connected and they're less, they're really sort of riding the coattails of these guys. They're benefiting from all that debt and pushing up asset prices. And they get some inside track as well, but not as much as these connected billionaires. So it shouldn't really. I should also say these billionaires, they're so influential now, and arguably have been for some time, that they don't just get the first track on news. These guys, they get together. They have a lot of shared ideologies, and they're able to actually construct the news. If you like, they direct where a nation's going. They even direct international policy. And so if you know what's happening, if you are actually causing global change, especially, or national change, you can position your portfolios, you can trade ahead of that, and you've really got a license to print money. So you should expect these guys to carry on accelerating their wealth, their share of the nation's wealth. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that anyone that would come along and disrupt that agenda, anyone who they don't have any influence over, who comes along and changes the direction, can cost these guys a lot of money and really ruin their plans. And also, these guys are pretty arrogant. They're used to getting their way. So when an upstart comes along like Donald Trump and completely throws a spanner in the works, expect the media outlets which they own to vilify them completely. And indeed, that's what you see. And not just nationally, but on the international stage. If a nation is to get out of alignment with their international agendas, like Russia did with Syria, so they messed up their plans for pipelines and their plans for Syria, expect them to get vilified too. And sure enough, Putin is also incredibly vilified. in the press. So hopefully that's just a bit of understanding on who these guys are and what, and how they operate. The key to understanding what's going on with our wealth. This next chart also, I think, paints it very well. You'll see here it describes the bottom 90%. So this is the average person, the working class, even the middle and upper class, really, and it also shows the top 0.1% in this case. So you can see again the 70s, the top 0.1% in this chart showing of steadily, almost parabolically, been growing their wealth, and you can see the exact opposite's gone on with the 90%. Their standard of living and their wealth has been in decline. And you can see it's coincided with debt. Having control of the monetary system is a great way to grow your wealth. And so as this debt spiked up during the World War periods, you saw the 0.1% grow their wealth, the 90% lose out. Wage earners had less purchasing power, and then it corrected. The gold standard forced honesty on the system. You couldn't just print money when it had to be backed by gold. And then since then, now you've had this parabolic increase, and again you're seeing this increase in the wealth here, and the decrease in the wage earners. This also explains that inequality in wealth and how it affects the wage owners. What you've got on the right here is the ratio of incomes to house prices globally. Again, it's going back to the 70s to current times, and you can see around the 70s, before the gold standard was broken, 2 to 3 salaries, 2 to 3 years worth of income was enough to buy an average house in all these different nations. And sure enough, today, you're needing 5 to 6 times the average salary to buy the average house. So you can see how the wealth share of the wage earner has decreased. If you're a wage earner, especially if you're entering the workforce for the first time, for that 90%, the only asset they have is their profession, is their wage. It's unlike the wealthy, the ruling class who have an enormous amount of assets and are born into those assets. They benefit from this increase you're seeing here, but the wage earners don't. That just means things are getting more and more out of reach for them. So this increase in debt we're seeing, this parabolic increase in debt, it erodes the wage earners' purchasing power in two ways. So first of all, obviously through asset prices increasing, like we're showing here. Asset prices get increasingly out of reach. But the other less subtle way is that as debt gets higher and higher and higher, central banks have to keep rates lower and lower and lower to make it maintainable, to keep the interest payments affordable on that debt. But as money gets that cheap, as it becomes cheaper and cheaper to borrow money, it becomes easier and easier to replace workers with labour-saving devices. Now all of a sudden it's cheap to get a loan to pay for robots or to pay for AI or software or any labour-saving device. So the wage earner loses the ability to demand higher wages. Really, it really caps the ability of them to increase their wages. As is globalization as well. But you're really competing against this interest rate. It's pushing money from the asset owners, towards the asset owners and away from the wage earners. So history's shown us that this ruling class, if they can engineer a scenario which will allow them to keep growing their wealth, they will do that. So when you look back at the Great Depression, you saw the destruction of the wealth of the ruling class. Don't expect that to repeat itself necessarily this time around. There's no gold standard anymore. They've got the hindsight of what they broke that gold standard successfully. So expect them to be even more creative and ingenious in the way they might manage these scenarios going forward. So we should next just step in and try and understand what these scenarios are. What could these other options look like going forward? The ruling class, they're aware they don't want civil unrest. They're going to try and do what they can to maintain law and order. They certainly want to maintain their wealth. The last thing they want is to lose their wealth because of disruption. They don't want more populists getting voted, more upstarts like Trump coming along and disrupting their plans. They obviously don't want a revolution where they get, like's happened in the past, where their wealth gets confiscated off them through riots and through force. But at the same time, if they can find a legitimate way to grow their wealth, continue growing it, they will definitely take that if they perceive it as being viable. So with all that, let's now look at some scenarios going forward that may eventuate as this as this whole debt money issuance becomes more increasingly unsustainable. What are the scenarios going forward? The first scenario I've got here is socialism. It doesn't get a lot of airtime. It's perhaps not very more people wouldn't consider this very, very likely, but I think it's really got some some merit for a number of reasons. So first is obviously it conditions the people to accept a lower standard of living. It conditions them to accept less freedom and lower standard of living. So that obviously helps, the agenda of the ruling class. Secondly, it funnels a greater and greater share of the nation's assets into the ruling class's hands, and these guys, they suddenly, through their networks, through their connections, through their corporations that are getting government contracts, through their the loyalists and within in Parliament, they get control over a larger and larger share of the nation's assets. The assets were pulled away from the private asset owners, private sector, pulled towards into the government sector, so they get more control. And the other thing is, even if the whole thing falls over like it did in the USSR, if the whole socialism structure falls over, they're the only ones that can step in and buy those assets. They're the only ones with any real wealth. So just like happened in Russia, these Russian oligarchs came in, they bought the nation's assets at pennies in the dollar. So then now they legitimately own them outright. They don't even need to use their network anymore to control them. Now they own them outright legitimately. So for all those reasons, this is really beneficial for them, both in growing their wealth and in terms of maintaining that social cohesion, allowing them to do so in a way that doesn't cause social unrest, really. There's other signs of this too. The other thing I noticed, I see more and more tech billionaires and tech CEOs supporting higher wages. Supporting rather living wages, I should say, and higher taxes, supporting that sort of socialist theme. And I think it's also of note too that quantitative easing that we've seen is effectively a form of socialism already. You are basically confiscating assets from the private sector and bringing them into the state sector when you print money and buy assets like that through quantitative easing. So if this scenario plays out, what is the best asset to be in? Well, that's a tough one. Almost no assets are safe under socialism. The government's going to come after everything. Even gold has the potential to be confiscated, although it's better than many. I actually think cryptocurrencies have the best shot in the socialist environment because of their ability to be anonymous and their ability to be totally outside of the reach of government. So I'm going to say cryptocurrency is the asset of choice under this scenario. So scenario number 2 I've got here, I've called currency reset. This does get a lot of airtime, this one. Essentially, if the old monetary system becomes unsustainable and isn't working anymore, then introducing a new one starts to be a very attractive option. So, that new currency, it could be a cryptocurrency. It would certainly have to be backed by assets, at least initially, to get some confidence behind it. Gold is an obvious candidate to be backing a new currency system. And the beauty about this option for the ruling class, and another reason why it's quite likely, is because they'll have a heads up on if it's going to happen and when it will happen and what shape what form it'll take. And if you know that, boy, you've got a chance to just multiply your wealth share many times. You could borrow the failing currency, knowing that debt's going to become worthless, and buy up all sorts of hard assets that are going to do well after the reset. So this is again, it's a great way for the ruling class to legitimately grow their wealth even more spectacular than they already have, and also to do so in a semi-legitimate way that purges the old system and gives you another whole few generations of control over the nation's assets. So under this scenario, a currency reset, gold would have to be standout. I think a hard asset's going to have to back a new currency to get confidence for it. So I'm going to say gold's number one asset of choice under this scenario. But cryptocurrencies and other hard assets like property and commodities will also be standout investments. If the old currency is failing and going to disappear, any hard asset is the answer, is where you want to be. Right, so scenario 3, I've called this currency debasement. Now this is basically if the status quo was taken too far, if the central banks step back into quantitative easing and just keep printing money, the market will quickly realise, man, we are never getting out of this. The central bank is never going to undo this printed money. They're never going to reduce their balance sheet and give those assets back to the private sector. And so people would realise in this scenario that, man, money's never going to pay a real yield again. They're just going to keep printing to get out of this. And I think quickly people would rush for the exits. Hyperinflation happens when people lose confidence in the currency. You can look at Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Germany after the war. it's all the same story. Printing money and debasing the currency, and it does get rid of the old debt when the currency fails, but really it causes a lot of problems. It causes hyperinflation. You will get social unrest because wage earners won't be able to afford anything. It's not pretty, and it's never designed. The people go into this, they don't hope for it, but it's just it's a failed way of dealing with too much debt, really. It's unlikely we may start this process, but I think surely central bankers and the ruling class know this isn't a viable option. But anyways, nonetheless, it's here as option. It's scenario 3. It certainly gets a lot of speculation. If this was to happen, then again, all hard assets would do very well in a hyperinflationary environment, particularly gold and cryptocurrencies. I think they perform best. Other financial assets like stocks and property do okay, but because they're reliant on debt, they don't do so well because interest rates do end up having to get really high to try and stabilise the currency, get some free fall, and obviously really high interest rates aren't favourable to highly leveraged assets like financial assets and property. So I'm going to say gold and cryptocurrencies do best under this currency debasement, excessive QE money printing scenario. So scenario 4 I've got here, depression. So this is the one. This is the honest one. This is what happened last time, and it still may happen again. I suspect we'll have to have at least a sense of this happening in the market for a radical change like the first 3 scenarios we've mentioned. I think for that to be even accepted or tolerated, you'd need things to get pretty bad first. So although I'm not expecting a depression, I think it's quite likely we have the beginnings of a depression. At least the market's starting to price it in to force and to justify really one of the other scenarios coming into play. But the Great Depression, as we've mentioned, is really just that debt, rather than plateauing like we saw in the Great Depression. It's a total resetting of that debt. It's defaults, it's write-downs, it's that debt coming right back down. Debt forgiveness. It's coming right back down to where it a sustainable level again. That's a very painful scenario to go through. You do get a lot of companies fail. Anyone with much debt really fails in the Great Depression. Cash becomes king. Everyone's just trying to stop their assets from being confiscated by banks. So anyone with debt's desperate to get cash to pay off those debts before all the assets collapse in value. So the only form of asset that does well in a depression is cash. You want to get out of everything else. So this is really difficult, isn't it? Because you've got, in this scenario, cash is king, have to have cash. Other scenarios, cash disaster, get the hell out of cash. So you can see the difficulty you've got with these scenarios. So bear in mind, I think the depression scenario is likely as a first wave, but I don't think personally it's likely to go all the way. I think the ruling class have learnt too many lessons from the previous Great Depression. They've got a lot more tools now too. Without the gold standard, they can avoid giving up their wealth. So I fully expect them to find a way to do that. Option 5 I've got here is war. Obviously this isn't anyone's pick or choice. It's the reason why I've got it though is it can happen. Financial stress can increase tensions with countries. Trade wars like we're seeing now, but can ultimately lead to outright war if you're not careful. But also it has been used historically as a way, if the ruling class there's a lot of corruption and a lot of unsustainable. The systems become totally financially unsustainable. It is an easy way to distract the masses and to cover over. It gives them the scapegoat. It allows them to effectively reset the system without taking the blame for it. So it can be useful from that way. So it could be orchestrated in that sense. Obviously, no one would ever wishes for an outright nuclear war, but just a threat of a war or even just a small conventional skirmish with between superpowers could be enough to really cause total disruption and some resetting of the financial system and failing of banks with a scapegoat story. The reason why I think it's got some legitimacy too is you are seeing this demonization of Russia going on, this rekindling of those historic tensions. So it makes me think, is this being set up as a potential, in the back pocket as a potential scenario to save the ruling class if things go wrong? I don't know. Obviously, we hope that war never happens. And look, if it does happen, or if the market just believes it's going to happen for a while, gold is going to be the standout asset. It's the only thing that really does exceptionally well during wartime. In the Second World War, international trade was only done. Gold was the only thing that anyone would accept. There's no point taking currencies from nations that may not be there, or whose currency might be worthless. So gold by far is the asset of choice in a war scenario. And the last one I've got here, option 6 or scenario 6 is I'm calling revolution. This is obviously this is no one's desire either, but it certainly happened in the past. It's worth mentioning. It's really the scenario where if the ruling class's arrogance goes too far and they continue to push for more and more wealth at the cost of the working classes, who get more and more disgruntled and more upset, they can go too far, and you can end up with an outright rebellion from the people. You can have them storming mansions and wealthy people getting their assets torn off them and killed. Quite frankly, it's not a nice scenario. It's the one thing that makes me think, is this at least a possibility, or at least the ruling class trying to get a hedge in place to prevent this? I do notice that this constant push for disarmament at the moment, and it concerns me that this push for getting rid of the guns in the population in the US is happening now at a time when the financial system is the most fragile it's ever been. I don't think it's a coincidence that that's going on. I do think the ruling class would be keen that this option gets taken off the table. And it really is taken off the table. If the guns are gone, if the population is disarmed, the revolution with today's military technology, revolution is completely off the table now if the guns are disarmed. It happened in Venezuela, in 2012. In Venezuela embarked on disarming the population, successful in that. And then the the dictatorship in place now has been able to easily squash. There's been many rebellions and uprisings, but they've been able to squash them all quite very easily. Pitchforks no longer cut it. In the old days, there was a lot of people, masses with pitchforks had a lot of power. Not so much these days with military hardware the way it is. So I hope they don't. I hope they're not successful in disarming the masses. I think it's especially in this current environment, it's really important that the people, at least a threat needs to be there to keep the up and honest and to keep the ruling class honest. But obviously, hopefully, it never comes to it. The assets of choice in this scenario, this is a breakdown of society when it happens. So many assets become worth next to nothing. The things that gold, I'd say, would be the best financial asset. But basic goods and services, foods, medicine, guns, they all become very desirable when society breaks. So where does that all leave us? Well, the short answer is an extremely difficult situation. With so many unknowns, there's the timing. We don't know the timing. It could be this debt super cycle could be coming to an end this year. It could be 10 years out. The can could be kicked down the road, and the current financial system could continue for potentially 10 years. So that's the first thing we don't know. Second, we don't know the scenario. Of all those scenarios we've outlined, we don't know which one we're going to ultimately head down. And thirdly, we don't know the order. It's unlikely we're going to head straight into one scenario. It's quite likely we're going to start off heading down one and the market will price at another. We could, first of all, market might start pricing in the Great Depression. Then the central banks might make noises and people think, we're going to be currency debasement. Then we could trade tensions and currency wars could flare up and the market start worrying and pricing in a real war. And then bang, we could have a currency reset, or socialist government could start, gaining traction in the polls. So there's so many twists and turns this could potentially take, and also be aware too that actually benefits the ruling class. They've got a huge amount of wealth to shift, to reposition during this changing of the guard, if you like, and they're not going to want to flag through the media that they own, with the direction they're planning on taking this thing. So it's to their advantage, sadly, to wrong foot the rest of us, and so they can get their affairs in order first. So, with all that said, there were three assets that came out in most scenarios. There were these three assets that came out very well. There was cash, gold and silver, and cryptocurrencies. So if you had an allocation to these, you would be you'd be far better positioned than the vast majority of people. Cash, hardly anyone has material cash savings these days. Everyone's invariably invested or indebted. Gold and silver these days, very few people have a gold and silver allocation, and even fewer have a cryptocurrency allocation. So if you did have an allocation to these assets, you'd be well positioned and have good hedges in place for these scenarios. So let's go through each one of those in more detail to understand the merits and how they might fit in a portfolio. So first of all, cash. So cash is the most difficult one, as we said. It could be the worst or the best performing asset depending on how things play out. If the status quo carries on in particular, you can expect cash to potentially carry on being a terrible investment. If money supply keeps being created, doubling every 10 years, if central banks keep creating money along those lines, you can expect cash to carry on losing its purchasing power. For wage earners to keep giving up that purchasing power for the assets to come increasingly out of reach. So it can be the worst investment, but as we head down, as these scenarios start unfolding, and particularly as I think the Great Depression with Depression is the most likely to start, it could also be a very good investment. But to understand the value of cash, I think it's important to take a step back and understand inflation, because inflation is really what defines the value of cash and the value of keeping it. Many people argue, cash hasn't been that bad an investment. Inflation's not been that high, but let's really understand what's been going on with inflation to test that theory. There's been two significant changes in my mind. The first was in 1983. We had a change in the inflation CPI measure. House prices were excluded from it. So it now became purely a consumption measure. There's no longer any investment assets in the basket. And then in 1999, another significant change happened. They changed the basket to a cost of living measure rather than a purely inflation measure. And by that we mean that the basket of goods now constantly changed to match the spending habits of the consumer. So what does that mean? Well, let's see now, if the dollar loses purchasing power with respect to assets or investments, that will no longer show up. If the ruling class are successful as they have been in acquiring more and more of the nation's wealth and pushing asset prices more and more out of reach of the wage earners, that will never show up in the inflation measures anymore. And even more concerning, if now that the basket continuously changes to match spending patterns, even if people are losing purchasing power and getting poorer, if you think about it, the average person is spending all the income they're earning. A little bit of savings backwards and forwards aside, they really, if they now get poorer or lose purchasing power, their only option is to buy a different good, buy a cheaper good, or go without. And of course, so now the basket's just going to conveniently track that too. So if something suddenly becomes unaffordable, if organic chicken is no longer affordable and people move down to battery farm chickens, and maybe move down again to some synthetic substitute, it's no longer going to be picked up in the inflation measure, because any good that becomes too expensive now is naturally going to be purchased less and conveniently fall out of the inflation basket. So what that really does is that actually means that the inflation measure now is really capped by wage increases, because now that the people can only pay for goods what they're earning. So if their wages, assuming they're spending everything they're earning, which they largely are, if their wages go up 2%, they can only spend 2% more on their goods. Any price inflation greater than that's going to force them to change their spending habits, which of course, again, conveniently the basket will change to match. So really, by design, the inflation measure no longer picks up inflation. As crazy as that sounds, and there's a number of reasons for that. It's definitely in the government's interest, and of course, ruling class's interest to have the measure do that. So many things are benchmarked to inflation. Social welfare is, the wage increases for many workers are benchmarked to inflation. The debt which is in the system, and the debt which the government is borrowing, is the interest on that is tied to inflation. So there's a lot of reasons why the CPI measure has been massaged to essentially hide inflation. Now, what is useful is there are people who still run these old measures under the old rules. Shadow Stats is one, but their website. And anyway, if you measure it under the old measures before those rules changed, it comes out with inflation running between 6 and 10%. If you include housing and stuff, it's the 10%. If you include a basket that doesn't keep changing for the low quality goods, it's running closer to 6%. So massively high. So you can see old cash, and that's really where you see indeed cash has been a terrible investment. What we're saying about the purchasing power being eroded is very apparent if you use traditional inflation measures. So that's cash. It's all that said. If we do head down a Great Depression scenario, you're going to need cash. It's people are desperate to not go into default, to not have the bank take all their assets off them as they're losing jobs, or as they're going into negative equity on all their investments. Cash can be king again for a period. You're going to want some. So that takes us next to gold. Gold, I think, was a standout. I think in most of those scenarios, gold did very well. It's traditionally been a safe haven. It's only sort of more recent times where it's been smeared to the point where most people don't even own it anymore. But nations where they've experienced currency collapses and corruption, particularly in Asia and developing nations. The value of gold is very well understood. And as it was in the West before the gold standard was broken, and everyone was led to believe that the dollar is the only way to go. And of course, the dollar only earned its gold standard status, its reserve currency status, because it was originally backed by gold. And indeed, again, if we have the changing of the guard in this new system we're in, I think gold will again become a key player. So, gold. Why is gold valuable? Well, as cash is doubling in value doubling in quantity every 10 years, and potentially is going to be devalued much more if debt becomes unsustainable. Gold doesn't increase in supply even near as much. I worked out it's roughly 12% is added to gold supply every 10 years when you take out bits that are used for industry and what have you, which isn't very much. Most of the gold is above ground and is really just in the form of coins, bars, or jewellery. So, gold and its cousin silver, I think they come out on top of most of these scenarios. I think it's very worthwhile considering seriously having an allocation to those. So that brings me to cryptocurrencies. So cryptocurrencies get a lot of flack and a lot of negative press, but for some really misunderstood reasons. So before we look at the merits of this, let's just cover off a couple of those criticisms that it frequently gets. The first thing people say about crypto is it's just too volatile, and how can I invest in that? First of all, we should expect an emerging asset class like cryptocurrencies to be volatile. It makes total sense. There's no price history, there's no precedent for what it should be worth. You've got a range of expectations that go from many analysts saying it should be worth nothing, to other analysts saying it should be worth $1 million a Bitcoin. So with such a wide range of price, ideology and no history, it makes total sense that an emerging asset class like cryptocurrency is extremely volatile. The second criticism, people say, it's just far too risky. How can I invest in something that risky? Well, you should always balance riskiness of an asset with your allocation to it. You can manage the risk of an asset by just buying less of it if it's too risky. So take, for example, a bull run in stocks. An exceptional bull run in stocks like we've been in for the last 10 years, you might achieve a 200% return. And a really bad crisis, you might lose 50%. Of course, you can lose worse if it's a Great Depression or something worse, but let's say 50%. Crypto bull run, when crypto has a great year and does well, you can expect a 2,000% return. That's the sort of returns you're seeing in a crypto bull run. And when cryptocurrencies have a bad turn into a bear market, you can expect a 90% drop. So if you want to allocate a sort of risk-weighted equivalent risk-weighted allocation to cryptocurrencies, you would just allocate, 10% of what you'd allocate to equities. So, in other words, if you wanted to make 20,000 profit during a great bull run, you would need to put in 10,000 to the stock market, but you could potentially achieve that same return with just 1,000 in cryptocurrencies. Now, the beauty about that is the most you've got to lose in that instance is $1,000. Cryptocurrencies can only go to zero and lose you 1,000. Your investment in stocks can obviously lose far more. Easily lose 5,000 and maybe lose more than that. So, riskiness, you need to balance with that. Riskiness can be a good thing if you can get a great return with this on your small allocation. The other criticism that cryptocurrencies get a lot, people say, but new coins are being created all the time. And that's really, they're saying supply is going to keeps increasing, so it's going to keep eroding the value of coins. That's really irrelevant, it doesn't really make any sense, that argument. I think any business always has, any sector always has new brands and new businesses stepping in and, jostling for a shot at the big time and trying to make it. And of course, nearly all of them amount to nothing. If you think about the market share of the top 10 companies in any sector largely stays constant. If anything, it steadily grows, despite all these upstarts coming in trying to get a piece of the action. And it's no different in cryptocurrencies. If you own those top 10 cryptocurrencies, you're going to do very well. They're going to maintain market share. It's kind of irrelevant how many new starters come into the scene and try and make it. The old one will make it, of course, and if you really want to take a shot, a bit riskier shot, you can invest in some of those new ICOs, but it's kind of relevant to the main stay investor who's just going to invest in the main brands. So, the risk profile of cryptocurrencies is attractive when you size it correctly. It's got the other great feature that you've got the potential in cryptocurrencies to make a lot of money, even in normal times. I think that's key to make, a key point to make. In normal times, cash is most likely to continue to be terrible, Gold at least keeps up with inflation, because it's not increasing in supply at all, and it's got that 5,000 years of history. You can expect it to keep up with inflation, real inflation, not fictitious inflation. It will maintain its purchasing power. But cryptocurrency is the only one that can really knock it out of the park in normal times. You potentially do much better than just maintain its purchasing power. So that's another attractive feature with cryptos. But the most attractive feature of cryptocurrencies is that they are totally outside the system. They can't be seized. They no government can grab them off you. They can make it difficult. They can certainly shut down exchanges, but they can't stop peer-to-peer transactions. They can't stop you owning them. No court system can confiscate them. No banking system can seize them. It's the only asset class that's really totally outside of the system. So if the system really gets corrupt or goes or completely implodes, or a desperate government's trying to seize assets, a socialist government's trying to seize assets, it's the only asset which is immune, safe from all that. So that's why I bring up cryptocurrencies and would suggest they're also a useful asset class as we go through some of these scenarios. And that really leads us to the end of the presentation. So look, I hope that's been helpful to you. I hope it wasn't too dry, and I hope it shed some light and painted the big picture. It was my goal in doing this video. So good luck with your investing. Thanks for listening. Cheers.